Well, thank you, Fiona, for that introduction, and thank you to Gillian and colleagues for organising this seminar today. And thank you to all of you for coming along. So as Fiona said, my research for a long time has focused on the loss, bereavement and trauma experiences of children and young people, and how these experiences interface with the justice system. So as a result of that, I'm really interested in institutional and organisational responses to trauma. And on that note, as Fiona said, I'm here today to talk to you about children's experiences of police custody in Scotland. I want to share a little bit about their experiences, and I want to talk a little bit about what their experiences tell us about the ambition that Scotland becomes the best place in the world to grow up, and what they mean for the aim that Scotland becomes a nation that has a trauma-informed workforce. So before I share my slides, I'm going to pop my camera off. I find it quite distracting to see my face while I'm trying to present, and I'm sure you do too. But yeah, do pop any questions in the chat and shout out if there's any problems, because I won't be able to see your faces when I'm presenting. And if my stomach rumbles throughout this, then I do apologise, because I'm definitely a 12 o'clock eater when it comes to lunch. So bear with me while I share my slides. Okay, hopefully you can all see those slides. Give me a shout if you can't. So firstly, to give you a bit of background context to the use of police custody for children, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child sets out a number of articles that are relevant to the detention of children in police custody. And the Scottish Government has committed to incorporating the UNCRC into Scots law to the maximum extent possible. I'm not going to go through all of the relevant articles here, but I will return to them later. But some key articles are Article 1, that says a child is anybody aged under the age of 18. Article 37 is concerned with what happens when a child is detained. And this states that a child should only be arrested or detained as a measure of last resort. When they are detained, a child should not be treated to inhumane or degrading punishment or treatment, and that detained children shall be held separately from adults. Now, I'm summarising here. There's a lot more detail in these, and we'll come to some of that in a little bit. Article 40 is concerned with the administration of juvenile justice, and this states that a child in conflict with the law should be treated in a manner consistent with the promotion of the child's sense of dignity and worth, which reinforces the child's respect for human rights and which takes into account the child's age. So this is really about enabling fair and equitable access to justice. So that's some of the international context. But here in Scotland as well, in 2017, NHS Education Scotland launched Transforming Psychological Trauma. So this is a tiered knowledge and skills framework that sets out the competencies required for trauma-informed practice, depending upon a person's role and contact with individuals who have experienced trauma. And there's a national trauma training plan that supports the development and implementation of this framework. So across Scotland, there's a real drive to implement trauma-informed practice in a whole range of settings, including across the full reach of the justice system. And this is something that Police Scotland have signed up to, as you can see from this quote here. And also, with recent developments exploring the uses of places of safety for children, Police Scotland have recently acknowledged that custody is not a suitable place for children, and reconfirmed that they have no desire to hold children in custody. And most recently, we have the Children's Care and Justice Bill, which was presented to the Scottish Parliament just before Christmas there. And this aims to amend current legislation to ensure that all under 18s are treated as children and that they should be held in a place of safety. And this place of safety should not be a police station in most circumstances. And it ensures that under 18s cannot consent to being interviewed without a lawyer, for example, among many other amendments. So far, so good, right? The context looks good. We have some good policies and commitments and legal instruments to really ensure that, I guess, children's experiences of police custody is trauma-informed and rights-respecting. And things are moving in the right direction, that is true. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that there's such a long way to go, and we must not underestimate the gulf between what is aspirational and what is current reality for children. We need to reflect on where we really are if we are to create meaningful change for children and young people. So what we do see is that significant numbers of children are still detained in police custody, often overnight, and harmful or disproportionate practices still exist. So data from 2021 found that 6,000 children were held overnight in police cells. Now that number is reducing. I think information from the Scottish Police Authority in kind of late 2021 suggested that that was maybe around 4,000 children, but that's still a significant number of children. And although the use of taser is thankfully very low in Scotland, it is increasing. So it's increased from 6 uses in 2018 to 25 uses in 2021. And strip searches are also reducing, but these are really distressing for children. And a freedom of information request by our centre back in 2020 found that in the vast majority of times that strip searching is used, 96% of nothing is found. So it's hard to see how this is a proportionate approach to children and young people. And really, I think what is helpful, I think, to sum up the experience of police custody, Skins and Worth in the study of adults in English police stations describe police custody as the initial and critical point in the penal painscape. And I think that's a really important way to describe people's experiences of police custody. We also know that while commitment to trauma-informed practice at the top is really important and leadership is needed for successful implementation of trauma-informed practice, the reality on the ground can be somewhat more challenging. We've seen that in our research with trauma-informed practice among prison staff. And there are also attitudinal issues towards those who have caused harm and are not seen as vulnerable or as victims. So research into the impact of training in relation to adverse childhood experiences and trauma for police officers by Gillespie Smith and colleagues in 2020 found that attitudes towards trauma-informed practice tended to be more favourable thinking about victims, witnesses, or those experiencing a mental health crisis, rather than those accused of crimes. And attitudes were also more favourable when considering younger children rather than older teenagers who may be perceived to be more like adults. But like prisons, police custody is at the sharp end of justice. And in light of this, my argument is that it is not possible to be trauma-informed in police custody or prison, and it's disingenuous to suggest otherwise. In fact, these places are antithetical to trauma-informed practice. Instead, they create harm and trauma and violate some of the most basic principles of trauma-informed practice. Now, some of this may be inevitable. The fundamental purpose of these organisations is at odds with trauma-informed practice. Being arrested, being taken to custody, it's never going to be a pleasant experience, no matter who you are or how well you are treated. So at CYCJ, we have drawn on lots of different evidence that has led me to this conclusion. From our work with young adults who tell us that they feel targeted and discriminated and deliberately wound up by police to provoke a reaction, to the really harrowing trauma experiences of young men in prison. But today, I'm going to draw on a particular study that stemmed from our research into bail and remand back in 2020. Now, I have to give a really big shout out to my colleagues Donna and Christina, who undertook the initial stages and the fieldwork for this research. And this research looked at the experiences of bail and remand from the perspectives of children, their families, and also from justice professionals. So 33 interviews were undertaken, as well as a survey of local authority staff, and there were interviews with 11 children. And this study wasn't focused on police custody at all, but police custody emerged as one of the most distressing aspects of the justice journey. And as we were preparing our bail and remand report, this really struck us, it really stood out to us. So I kind of returned to the data and reanalyzed and mapped these children's experiences to see how trauma-informed and rights-respecting their experiences were. So what I'm going to share today is an analysis of the experiences of these 11 children who had experience of police custody around sort of 2019, 2020. So these were all children who were aged 16 and 17. They were almost all boys, but there was one girl in the sample. So I'm just going to share their experiences and align them to the core principles of trauma-informed practice. So the most basic underlying principle of trauma-informed practice, as outlined by SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, so an organization in the US, excuse me, that has been really kind of instrumental in developing these kind of principles of trauma-informed practice. But the most basic principle, if you do one thing in relation to trauma-informed practice, is do no harm and to restore a sense of safety. It's this sense of safety that is so often taken away when people experience trauma. So people need to feel physically and psychologically safe. The setting where they are needs to be safe, and the organization that is working with them needs to promote a sense of safety. The organization needs to understand safety as defined by those who it is serving. Now, as I said, being arrested is never going to be a pleasant experience, but the experience was characterized by real fear and real anxiety for these children. So as you can see from these quotes, they talk about, the mental health suffering, they talk about crying myself to sleep, having an anxiety attack, being an emotional wreck. And it's really important to note that these children were held in custody for quite a substantial amount of time. So this emotional impact that they were experiencing went on for often several days. It wasn't just a few hours. It was often Friday to Monday, for example. So a real big, emotional, terrifying, frightening, upsetting, worrying experience for children. This experience was exacerbated by the presence of others, by the presence of adults who were aggressive or distressed. So while most children said they were not held directly with adults, many were held in close proximity to them and were affected by their behaviours. So they talked about hearing people screaming and shouting and crying and shouting out and banging on doors, and also kind of witnessing people defecating all over the cells as they were leaving police custody in the morning. And this proximity to adults was especially an issue and especially intense when leaving police custody and when being transported to court and being held in the court cells. So this was particularly worrying for children and young people. And although some young people felt, well, we just got to deal with it, there's this young person in the last quote says, you've got yourself lifted, so you're going to be thrown in that cell and you've got to be prepared for what you're going to hear. But this is really important to remember that we're talking about children who are experiencing this over an extended period of time. Also, importantly, children and young people often couldn't have their basic needs met. Children talked quite a lot about not being able to sleep. Sometimes this was because they were worrying about the situation. I'm sure we all lose a bit of sleep when we're feeling worried or upset, and also because of the noise that I've just described, but also because of the response that was put in place. So they were being woken fairly regularly. And when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you can't go on to develop a sense of safety until you have these basic physiological needs at the base of this hierarchy met. And children were telling us that these were not often met. as I said, the response that was put in by police, often, with really good intentions, very well-meaning about ensuring that the children in their custody, that their, well-being was maintained, often felt superficial to children, and frequently made that situation worse. So, as I said, children were woken every hour, sometimes every 15 minutes. This really kind of affected their mental health and their emotional state. The quote there at the end, the young person was talking about, really struggling with their mental health. They were very anxious while they were at the station. They had been interviewed, they were allowed to leave. And then the police decided that they needed to go to the hospital because of their deteriorating mental health. But their parents was not allowed to attend with them. They had to attend with police officers. And although they felt that they were entitled to leave, they also still felt that they were actually being held captive. So this was a really distressing experience for that young person there. So that's principle one. The second principle of trauma-informed practice is about trust and transparency. And this is really about ensuring that decisions are conducted with transparency, with the goal of building and maintaining trust. And what we found was that children were not often given sufficient information, or they weren't given child-friendly information to know what to expect, or what their rights were, or what the decisions were going to be. And at times, even when they were given information, it appeared that the information maybe wasn't given at the time that they needed it. So the quote there, the second quote, is from a young girl who was held over the weekend, and she had been held for a number of hours, or I think it was even a day, before she had realised that there was actually a bell in the cell that she could press and call, and an officer would come and check on her well-being and see if she needed anything. And this hadn't been explained to her, or if it hadn't been done in a way that she was able to retain that information during a stressful situation. And also because children didn't know what to expect, and they didn't know what their rights were, and they didn't know what the process should be. On the times where the process wasn't followed or didn't happen as it should, children were not aware of that. So the quote there talks about a young person who declined to have legal representation. They perhaps naively had trust in the system that all they needed to do was talk and tell the truth and everything would be fine. But it was only afterwards that they realised that actually they maybe should have had legal representation. So when things aren't transparent about what children are entitled to, they don't know how to challenge that, or they aren't able to get other people to challenge that for them when they don't realise that these decisions and these rights aren't being met. The third principle of trauma-informed practice is about support, and this is frequently described as peer support, in that people who have experienced trauma would benefit from being supported by others who have this kind of lived experience and who understand what they are going through. But here we've kind of reconfigured it a little to be around kind of family support, and this was really quite inconsistent for the children who were held in police custody. Some did manage to have their family members attend and to support them, but many did not. Many were not allowed to communicate with their families and were reliant on other people to do that for them, which didn't always happen. And also when children were allowed visits, they were often not very child-friendly. So visits were held through a wee glass window or behind a partition, for example. So it's very difficult for children to access kind of close family support that they might have needed while in police custody. The fourth principle is about collaboration and mutuality. And this is really about working together to share power and to share decision-making, and to allow children the opportunity to meaningfully access and participate in justice. And as kind of highlighted in the previous principle, children were quite often not given the information that they needed. They weren't involved in any decision-making about what would happen, and at other times were actively and routinely discouraged from participating, ostensibly in their own best interests. So this child 9 here was explaining that they felt it was deliberately kind of kept blank. People deliberately didn't give them the information they needed, almost as part of the punishment. And this child at the end here was just told, you just need to be quiet when you're being spoken to, which is probably well-meaning, but doesn't allow children any genuine participation. When we think about principle 5, which is about empowerment, voice and choice. Now, in some ways, this might be understandable. Children don't have a choice about being arrested or being held in police custody. But even while they are being held, there was very little opportunity for them to have any control or say or decision-making in how things unfolded while they were in custody. So from being able to choose what they eat, even from a limited menu, this wasn't available to the children and young people. So that young person there at the top was speaking about only having one option to eat. It wasn't an option that they enjoyed, and ultimately they ended up stopping eating because the food wasn't suitable for them and they weren't able to choose something more appropriate. And child 8 there is talking about, not having any activities to do, and other children talked about even if there were activities, it maybe wasn't their choice. They were given a book that maybe wasn't something that they would choose to read, or they were given activity books, but not given everything they needed in order to kind of use those. And the final trauma-informed practice principle really is about acknowledging and trying to address the impact of historical, gender, and kind of cultural issues. There were particular issues, particularly for this young girl in custody, about privacy, about her ability to go to the toilet in private, and about her ability to access sanitary products. And she talked about, although she was aware that the image of her on CCTV was pixelated, she was also told at points that it wasn't a woman that was watching her, and that there was a male officer watching her, and this made her very uncomfortable to the point that she felt that she couldn't get changed, or she couldn't go to the toilet because of a man that was watching her. And also the kind of pixelation and the privacy that is afforded by that is usually limited, I think, to the toilet area rather than the entire cell. It's important to note this wasn't just about an issue for females. Some of the young men talked about, or the boys talked about, not having privacy and people watching them at all times. And also in terms of just being responsive, just simply the fact that these are children, they are vulnerable by virtue of their age. And this was really, really difficult for them. And this needs to be acknowledged, that they are children, and being held for 3 days or 4 days or 5 days is a significant period of time. So this young person talked about, being held in the cells for a number of days, and then being taken to court in the morning, and then being held at court almost all day, not being seen till quite late in the afternoon. And for that time that they were up at court, they were being held with adults, which was a really difficult experience for them. Okay, so there is a genuine desire for trauma-informed practice in Scotland and in policing. I think I would be really remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there have been positive changes that have happened or are happening in relation to children and police custody. And I suppose I'm not dismissing the challenges that the police face with the job they have to do. But as my colleague Donna so clearly said yesterday, of course, the police need to fulfil their legal duties, but doing so doesn't need to be in opposition to or in competition with their rights. But actually, when we mapped their experiences to children's rights, it did look as though a lot of children's rights were a lot of practice was not compliant with children's rights, and was often kind of violating their rights. So just to kind of very quickly run through some of these, in relation to Article 1, where all children under 18 should be treated as children, and it was quite clear that this wasn't happening for 16 and 17-year-olds. And although there is work underway to try and change that for these children, this was a particularly difficult experience. Article 18 is about parental rights and responsibilities, and we see that parents are quite often not involved and not given information, not able to support their children in these circumstances. So this quote here was about a young boy. He no longer lived with his mother, but they were close. And when he was arrested and taken into custody, she was not informed of this. And she obviously tried to contact her son, and she wasn't able to get a hold of him. She was asking all his friends. She was beginning to be increasingly concerned and worried for his safety and well-being. And it wasn't until she reported her child missing that she was advised that he was actually taken into police custody. And that was all of the information she was given. He wouldn't give her any more information about where he was, but that, you know, she knew at this point he wasn't missing, but it had taken her going to the police before she was given that information. And when we think about Article 37, as I said previously, this is about ensuring that treatment is not cruel or degrading. And actually what children tell us is that the experience of police custody appears to be unnecessarily harsh. If the aim of police custody is to keep a child safe and to make sure that they can attend court, once the court is reopened, then it doesn't seem to be necessary to keep children in conditions as they describe here, you know, a dark room, a tiny mattress, no pillow, or not having any access to appropriate sanitation. So a number of children talked about not being able to get a wash, not being able to get a shower. And, you know, this is a long time where children aren't able to access the kind of sanitation that they need. And Article 40 said it was about the administration of justice, and when we think about it, children are, you know, held for multiple days. They're saying that they can't sleep, they often haven't eaten, they haven't been able to wash. They're naturally, you know, fearful and anxious about what's going to happen when they go to court. They don't even have their own clothes if family members haven't been able to come down and bring clothes for them. And then a child is expected to turn up in court on a Monday and present their best self and come across well to a sheriff. And it does really feel as if the practices are not allowing children to present their best selves in court and to access a kind of fair justice. And Article 42 there is also about making sure that children are aware of their rights. And as I said, it was really obvious that children didn't necessarily know what they were entitled to, how they should be treated. And it was very inconsistent as to whether children had, as this young person said here, I wouldn't have had a Scooby Man without my lawyer. But children didn't necessarily always have legal representation, and some lawyers were better than others at supporting the child. So it wasn't as if children always had access to knowledge about their rights and then were not able to challenge or access their rights while in custody. So as I said, there is this genuine desire for trauma-informed practice, but it is really difficult to kind of implement. And also, you know, we find that sometimes trauma-informed practice is seen as being in opposition to children's rights. But actually, I think responding to children in a trauma-informed way and promoting their rights actually has the potential to make the police's job easier in the long run. So by promoting recovery and desistance, improving relationships and increasing their perceived legitimacy among children and young people, I think trauma-informed practice can actually support police's legal duties. I do think, although there is this kind of commitment to trauma-informed practice, I really feel, as I kind of set out at the start, that describing policing as trauma-informed, or even as progressing towards being trauma-informed, is at best imprecise, but potentially disingenuous, and might even be dangerous if it masks practices that are harmful, if it masks the urgency to remove children from these settings, or if it undermines great trauma-informed practice progress that is being undertaken elsewhere. So this is why I think it is important to be precise with language, and to maybe use the language of being trauma-aware rather than trauma-informed, which has become to mean something quite specific that is worked around these principles of trauma-informed practice. But I think what can be done, I've been sitting on this data since 2020, and I know Fiona is always asking me, like, when's this paper happening? I've always really struggled with this evidence that we've had. I thought it was really powerful and really important to share, but it's also really easy to highlight problems or deficits, but it's never as easy to be constructive or to generate solutions. But as I said, I think we need to be realistic about where we are with our practice in relation to children in police custody. We need to be precise with language, and we need to reflect and be open about these children's experiences. I think that's a really important start. as I keep saying, even with the best practice in the world, being arrested is going to be a difficult experience for children, but it can be significantly improved, even if it can't be trauma-informed. So firstly, trauma-informed practice needs to start with the organisation itself. And this is a step that I think is so frequently kind of missed over, and it's probably the most important step. So all organisations can become traumatised and experience trauma from the very nature of their work, or from their organisational culture, or from other factors. And so any trauma-informed practice work needs to start with a period of kind of deep and honest reflection about organisational culture. And this culture is often revealed by exploring this gap between the espoused intentions of policy and the realities of custom and practice on the ground. The concepts of organisational trauma do offer a way to understand this organisational culture and the impact of an organisation's work on that culture. And they provide a way of understanding and highlighting and identifying what might be unconscious aspects of organisational life. So what conscious and unconscious beliefs and attitudes sustain or hinder trauma-informed practice. We need organisational support for staff, and we need healthy organisational relationships. These are really essential to trauma-informed practice. We need appropriate pay and welfare policies for staff. We need staff development, and we need regular supervision. These are the kind of building blocks of trauma-informed practice. And while, of course, training is important, alone training is never enough to ensure trauma-informed practice. So once that work, and it's difficult and it's time consuming and there's not a clear way of doing it, but then and only then is an organisation ready to think about trauma-informed practice for others. Once that has been done, there are some really basic things that we need to do. We do need to reduce the number of children being taken into custody and use arrest and custody only when absolutely necessary. There may be times when a child does need to be arrested and does need to be taken into custody, but we know from what children are telling us that there are also times that children are detained for breaching curfew in what seem to be relatively minor ways. This doesn't seem to be a proportionate use of anybody's time. We need to, when children are arrested and detained, reduce the number of children held in police stations. So if overall numbers of children being arrested are reduced, then it shouldn't be unfeasible to hold almost all children in a more appropriate place of safety. And I know that work is ongoing at the moment to try and make progress with that. But we also really need to reduce the time that children are held in custody. And we know that children are probably more likely to be arrested at the weekend. And we do need to think about how we manage that. If you're arrested on a Friday, especially if it's a bank holiday weekend, and you're taken to court and you're not seen at court until late on a Monday or potentially even a Tuesday, then that's a really long time. And when children are taken to court, they need to be seen first thing, so they're not held and detained for any longer than is absolutely necessary. And then once all that is done, you probably get to the work that you think is about being trauma-informed, which is about, how we actually provide these places of detention or police custody. And this really has to involve working with children and young people to understand how principles can be implemented in a way that supports them but retains flexibility to respond to individual need. So as I said, when absolutely necessary, we need to detain children away from police stations, away from adults, and somewhere where the physical environment is calm and comfortable. We need to provide access to activities, including things like television and books and games. We need to allow face-to-face family visits as much as is appropriate. And we need to give children a choice about activities or visits or the food that they eat. And I know that it can be really challenging to support vulnerable or distressed children in custody, but we do need to think about a proportionate response to the possibility and risk of self-harm, implementing intrusive measures only when strictly necessary. And we need to ensure that children are empowered and supported to know their rights. We need to explain to children while they're in custody and before they ever come across police custody, multiple times and in multiple formats if needed, what their rights are and what is known about what will happen, and explain what is not yet known. So it's about ensuring that police custody is respectful to children and their rights. Okay. That's me finished, so thank you. I will stop sharing and turn on my camera if I can find it. Okay, thank you very much.